Welcome everybody. So we're here now on the Sustainable Economy Day for World Scientists Warning, Europe's pre-COP event, Planet in Crisis. Thanks very much for joining us, and we're very pleased to have Andy Tunstall here from Reading Hydro. As we've done on the other days, referring back to the scientists' warnings themselves, which is why we're here. Both the scientist warning in 1992, signed by 1,700 scientists, and the World Scientist Warning of a climate, and the World Scientists Warning, a second notice of 2017, signed by over 20,000 scientists, both mentioned economy as one of the major things we had to deal with, and we had to get away from this idea of unsustainable growth. The World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency on the 5th of November last year, so yesterday, 1 year ago, had a specific requirement on that. Excessive extraction of materials and over-exploitation of ecosystems driven by economic growth must be quickly curtailed to maintain long-term sustainability of the biosphere. We need a carbon-free economy that explicitly addresses human dependence on the biosphere and policies that guide economic decisions accordingly. Our goals need to shift from GDP growth and the pursuit of affluence towards sustaining ecosystems and improving human well-being by prioritizing basic needs and reducing inequality. Very, very clear. David Attenborough has said very similar things in his BBC programme Extinction quite recently. And we all know that we need to go carbon-free as soon as possible if we're to achieve staying under the 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees as required by the UN. So on that basis, and Andy's done some great work in doing this with his group, and is an example to everybody else of what can be done with community energy schemes. Andy himself has a background in oil, water, and energy in various posts ranging from finance, IT, sales, marketing, and strategy. He's more recently completed an MSc in renewable energy at the University of Reading. He's a director of the Green Group UK, and he's joined Reading Hydro CBS to advise on business strategy, partnership development, and when they had their all-important share issue, to turn the idea into a reality. So there's nobody better to talk to us about getting carbon-free and at the same time creating a sustainable economy than Andy. So thank you, Andy, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. And it's great to be able to speak to you here this afternoon from just outside Reading in the Thames Valley. So what I am going to do for you today is I've got a presentation that I think will last about 30 minutes. And I'm particularly going to pick up on some of the economics of this. It's a community-based thing, so it's a not-for-profit entity, so it doesn't generate profits, it generates a community fund, and I'll explain how that works, but also look at how the economics of something like a hydro scheme works. So I will start to share the screen for the presentation itself. Okay, so the header slide there, that is the Weir at Caversham, which is between just north of Reading on the River Thames. So quite a graphic picture of a lot of water going through the Weir system. Okay, so who is Reading CBS? CBS stands for Community Benefit Society. So it's a non-for-profit entity, and it's all volunteers. That's very important to do. And everyone you can see there, including the guy in the middle in the orange jumper, who is Dr. Tony Cowling, and he was the person who invented this concept. So. This is an idea that has taken it will take 7 years to go from an idea into reality. The first 4 or 5 years were all about thinking, as Tony walked across the Weir one day and saw this huge volume of water, thinking there's got to be some way that we can harness the power of the Thames and turn that into zero carbon electricity. So from that idea, it was all about trying to think about what technology was going to be used, and then crucially interacting with all the various different bodies that need to get involved with giving permission for such a construction. And this includes the local council, because the land on which the plant is going to be built is owned by the local council. Crucially, the Environment Agency, because even though you're effectively letting the water flow through a system, it has to be effectively abstracted at one end of the turbine and put back into the river at the other end. So you need quite a strange sort of two license to do that there as well. So all of these plans were sort of developed over that period from 2014 to 2018. And then when we got in 2019, the details of that, then that's when we decided how much we were going to need to raise, which we did via a public share offering. And I'll explain how we did that then. And then the idea being, once we got the money, the plant would be built in 2020. And it's not quite going to happen like that, but it's not far off. So let's have a look at some schemes that are available on the Thames at the moment. So starting up in Oxford, on the bottom left-hand side there, you've got a single screw system at Osney Lock. And then further downstream, a much bigger scheme you can see there at Stanford, which has actually got 3 Archimedes screws side by side in a similar sort of conceptual position next to the Weir that it will be in Caversham as well. Then if you look down on the left there, Maple Durham Mill is a very ancient old water wheel, but next to it has been built a more modern system that powers energy for the estate. And then on the bottom right hand side there, you'll see 2 quite large screws that are on the Thames at Romney Lock near Windsor, that actually provide the electricity for Windsor Castle. So the output of that system actually is used by the Queen. So where our project is in Reading. Reading is on the right-hand side of that map, and Caversham is on the left-hand side, on the north side. You can see there that there's the lock where boats can go through there, and there you've got the Weir, and then there's this little stretch of water here, which is exactly where our system is going. So what we're having to do is construct here. So it's just at the edge of the Weir and goes along this side here. This is called the mill race, this little amount of water there. And the mill race actually goes round the corner and back to the Thames over there. And there is apparently evidence of a mill in the Doomsday Book here. So it's been used for this kind of concept before. But this is where we are going to build it. And we're going to point out this building here on the right hand side. This is it's the old council run open air swimming pool called the Lido, or Lido, however you pronounce it, that is now a health spa owned by Thames Lido. And this is important because we've got the ability to supply that entity directly, and that makes a big difference on the economics, because we're going to be supplying most of the output from the system to a end user customer at a higher price than we'd be able to export it to the grid. So that makes a big difference to the economics of it. Okay. So this is the kind of technology that we are using. They're technically called reverse Archimedes screws. So the ancient Archimedes screw invention was all about having a device which could lift water up from a lower level river to a higher level in order to irrigate fields and so on. These work in reverse. So you've got the weight of the water flowing through it, going downhill, and it's the gravity that turns the screw, which goes via a gearbox to a generator and produces the electricity. So what sort of electricity is generated from this? So there's a formula which says that the output of a hydro system is proportional to the height of the flow of water times the diameter of the screws. And at this particular site, the average drop, if you like, of between the higher part of the river and the lower part of the river is 1.4 meters, which is relatively low. And what we're using there is 2 quite small turbines, 2.4 meter diameter screws, to actually extract the potential energy from the water flowing down through. So as in all hydro projects, you have something called a flow duration curve, and this shows you when the system will generate water. If there's too little water, it can't generate, and if there's too much water, the Environment Agency insists that we effectively lift the screws out of the water to let more of the water flow through, so that you don't get flooding. So this sort of cut in and cut out means that it's not a 24/7, 365 days a year operation, but it does have probably the advantage over solar, which is obviously only available during the day, and wind, which is only available when there are reasonable amounts of wind. But indeed, wind has a similar issue between cutting in and cutting out. So basically, this system will operate something like 70% of the time. When we first made the application, including to Ofgem, because this is one of the last schemes in the UK to benefit from the feed-in tariff. So the feed-in tariff closed at the end of March 2019, but as long as you build the system within 2 years, you still get the feed-in tariff. When we originally designed it, we thought we were going to connect the system to the local distribution grid, and that had a maximum capacity of 46 kilowatts. So our feed-in tariff application was limited to 46 kilowatts. But when we actually looked at the detailed design, we decided to slightly oversize the screws. So in fact, they could produce 65 kilowatts. So we asked, could we have the feed-in tariff increased to that higher amount, but we were told no. It's surprising in a way, but we were told no, and Ofgem had budgeted for us to put it through at 46, and that was all we could have. So what we've decided to do, the generator is going to need changing at 20 years anyway. So when we, and that's also the end of the feed-in tariff. So when the feed-in tariff goes and we put the new generator in, we'll put in that higher capacity generator there, so we'll get more energy out of the machine, and that's in part of the calculations. Keep going on, wait. And this gives you an idea of when in the year it will generate the most amount of electricity. And you can see that on the bottom there, you've got there 15 years worth of data. And when you're dealing with rivers, you do need a lot of data to make sure that you've got good sound groundings to make your predictions on. And you can see there in the spring, on average, it would be available to generate 94% of the time, but quite different during the summer and autumn where the river levels are lower. So when you take the output and you take the time and you multiply them together, you come out with 320,000 kilowatt hours per year, which is effectively about the same amount of electricity that would power 90 homes at average consumption. So it's not a massive system. Keep going the wrong way here. So when we've done that initial work, we came up with a budget estimate to build it of 700,000. The two big elements that you can see at the top were the actual turbines themselves, which basically cost £250,000, and the civil construction costs. And this is about basically breaking into the footpath area at the top of the weir, damming it off, building a cradle for which the screws can then sit in, and then all of the electrical equipment is then connected to it. So the construction costs were quite big there. You'll see an item there called a fish pass. This is a way of letting fish like salmon and eels go back upstream. Now, there was a fish pass on the weir at the moment, but I've heard it described to me that only the most athletic fish and eels could possibly use it because it's very short and very steep. So the Environment Agency insisted that we put in a proposal to do a much more natural, gradual steepness of fish pass, so that those kind of fish could actually get upstream if they wanted to. So that's very much in there as well. And then you can see there's bits about connecting to the grid or the end customer, which is what we're actually going to do in the end, and then actually raising all the money and some contingency elements there as well. So that's what we needed the money for. Going the wrong way. Now here's the financial model and how it all works. So the income the system will generate comes from the feed-in tariff, which I say we qualified for right at the end of the application. 90% of the electricity generated will be sold to a direct customer, which is good news because that's at a higher price. And 10% of the output is paid back to the grid. The operating costs of the system are pretty small, about £15,000 a year, and most of that is to do with making sure that there's no debris building up on the screens which are in front of the screws. So you've obviously got the water flowing towards the screws. There's all sorts of rubbish in the river, and they can collect in front of the screens to stop them going in, but you need to keep those screens clear. So that's a relatively manual, boring process to do, and then there's just a small amount of maintenance there. And then the rest of the costs are all about the financing element of this. So what we're doing is we are borrowing money from individual investors, we're paying them interest, and we're paying back their capital, but over quite a long period of time. And I'll show you exactly how that works in a minute. But if you take all of the income less all of the costs, there will be a surplus, but this is not profit. This is what we're calling a community fund. And this is a fund that people will be able to bid for. So it's quite interesting. In the introduction, Ed was talking about being carbon free and also human well-being. Well, the idea of the community fund is that will be an amount of money that people in the locality can effectively bid for in order to do sustainable projects. So it might be doing something to do with renewable energy, like putting solar panels on some sort of community building, or it might be providing energy efficiency measures such as insulation for the fuel core. So that's a big part of this, and that's part why it's called a community benefit society. I keep going the wrong way here, sorry about that. Now, going into a bit more detail. So in terms of capital, you've got to actually build the thing, and then we've got to replace the generator at a 20-year period. But in 20 years, that generator will cost more than it will at the moment. So we've had to think of how much it would cost today and what inflation factor to apply. Similarly, the operating costs, we've got a base amount, which we said was £15,000, and then we've got an inflation figure to add to that as well. And then our revenue, we've talked about the three avenues of that. So we've got some output, which is the same for the first 20 years and then goes up for the last 20 years. We've got the feed-in tariff, which we get on all of the output for the first 20 years. We've got the direct supply to the end user, which again, we've assumed we were going to do for 20 years. And then we're just supplying the grid after that. And then the grid supply is the wholesale price. And again, we've got to think about inflation because the feed-in tariff is mandatory linked to inflation as part of the government calculation. With the direct supply, we've actually got agreed a power purchase agreement with the leader, which again has got an inflation element to it. And the wholesale price is a bit more of an unknown, but one of the key things there is that the change in wholesale electricity prices over the last 10 years has been the normal inflation rate as well. And then we've got base prices to bring our total revenue. And then we take the revenue away from our operating costs and capital investment to get cash flow. And then we've got to talk about how we repay the investors. And that is a function of how much debt is outstanding, which we pay interest on, and then the capital repayments there. So putting it all together gives us that kind of model. So I'm not going to walk you through this spreadsheet, but I'm just going to pick up a few things here. So over on the left, you can see here, the number we're talking about is not 700,000, it's 980,000. I'll explain why that was there. But we know that if you replace the generator today, it would cost 24,000, but we're applying inflation so that by the time we do actually replace the generator in year 20, it's going to cost something like 39,000 there as well. We've got operating costs starting at 15,000, and we've just applied 2% to that there. Then we've got the output. You can see there 320,000, which then goes up to 365,000. We get the feed-in tariff on 100% of the output for the first 20 years only. We get 90% of the revenue to the end user in the first 20 years and 10% wholesale. And then we're changing it to do just 100% wholesale because we can't predict whether the Thames Lido is still going to be there in 20 years' time. And therefore, we've put some different inflation rates there. We've got 2.5% for both the feed-in tariff and the direct supply, and we've put a slightly higher rate for the wholesale price. Then we start looking at what actual unit price we're applying at any given time. The feed-in tariff is 8.13. We've agreed 12.5 pence per kilowatt hour for the direct supply on a starting basis, and a typical wholesale price at the moment is about 6p per kilowatt hour. Multiply those out, gives us the total revenue, less the operating costs and capital investment, so we get in-year cash flow and we get a cumulative position there. And then on the right-hand side, we can see that we've got debt repayment, and we're giving away different interest rates, you can see there, to our investors, and I'll comment on that a little bit further. So we're basically paying interest on the outstanding balance, and we're repaying a capital over a 25-year period. So for the investor, it's an interest rate which is relatively low, literally low, because it starts at 0, but does go up to about 4% after year 10, I think it is. So the investor's getting up to 4% interest, and he's getting his capital repaid back over 20 years. And then you can see what happens in terms of the cumulative position on that there. So that's quite a typical economic model for a renewable investment of any sort. You could do exactly the same calculation with wind, but the big difference going forward at the moment is that feed-in tariff column has disappeared, because you don't get feed-in tariff on any of these investments anymore. You're going the wrong way here. So this is what so if we ignore the financing, you can see that we start there at basically minus $1 million, let's call it in round figures, and you get to break even in about year 16, and then you build up a surplus over the rest of the period. But that's before financing. Every time. If you start looking at the financing, so this is to remember to repay the capital and the interest to the investors, and then you've also got a slightly lumpy replacement of the generator in year 21. You get this quite odd sort of curve there, but what you do get on the far right hand side is the size of the community benefit, which is over £200,000 over the whole of the 40-year period, but the majority of that is in the last 10 years of the operation of the scheme. Okay, so let's talk about raising the money for it. So we had our target of £700,000, and we decided to run that basically in the first 6 weeks of 2020. So we had he gave people the ability to pre-register for the shares in the last 2 weeks of 2019, and then the main share raise was until Valentine's Day. We thought that was quite symbolic, in February. So that's how that worked there. So we had a target £700,000. We had a minimum amount we wanted to raise of £426,000, and this was because we thought if we only got £426,000 as a fallback measure, we could probably borrow the rest from the bank. But we hoped we'd be able to raise that £700,000, and you could see that we had a very simple linear curve to go from that 6 week period to get from naught to £700,000. We probably thought that we'd get more at the beginning and more at the end and a lull in the middle, but that isn't exactly what happened. So we launched the scheme, and I sort of led the marketing side of that, given my experience. So a lot of Facebook posts, Facebook advertising, leaflet drops, local press, local radio, local television even. We did interviews and everything. A lot of interest from the public in the area. And as you can see, we more or less followed the curve, but because we also got a £100,000 grant from the government, we actually well exceeded our target and raised £872,000 by the end of the target raise period. So that was great, and we thought, right, we're really pleased with ourselves there. So as soon as we got all of the money, we started looking at the detail of the plan and making sure that all of the licenses, etc., were perfectly in place. And it became, and we had the agreement with Thames Lido as well. It became quite obvious quite soon that some of the budgetary elements were in danger of not coming out where we thought they'd be. Whereas we thought with things like the fish pass, we could probably do a bit of that ourselves, frankly, because it's very low technology digging and so on. Certain things looked like they were going to cost a lot more. And when you talk about mega projects like Crossrail and HS2, they always seem to overrun in terms of time and overrun in terms of budget. And we've found the same problem. And I think the problem happens is because when you're doing the initial estimates of what it's all going to cost, you haven't got enough money to spend enough detail on finding out exactly what it's going to cost, getting huge detailed designs and quotes as well. And some of our shareholders who bid for this did sort of say, be sure you don't need more money than that for the construction works. And that is what has proved to be. So when we were at the position at the end of March where we did an update, it was quite obvious that the cost increases outweighed the decreases. And there were problems to do with the civil quotations. So what we spent a lot of time doing was trying to look at various different ways that we could value engineer the solution so that we could still make it functional but cost less. And what that has meant is that the cost has gone up quite dramatically, but it could have gone up by a lot more as well. So it's all credit to the project team who are working on this that actually managed to find some solutions. The other thing that happened after the raise, of course, is COVID. And what that meant was that we had a lot of people that we wanted to help us with the design, and they certainly weren't available because they weren't allowed to work. So a lot of people were furloughed. So all of the decisioning that we had to make took a lot longer than we thought it was going to do. So we had hoped to build it in, to be complete in about November 2020. And because we couldn't start that preparatory work and we didn't get finalisation of all the things, then that's been pushed back a little bit as well. We also got in touch with Ofgem because we were on a 2-year construction thing to qualify for the feed-in tariff. So that would have expired at the end of March 2021. And we have got an extension, I think it's of another year. That's happened again because of COVID. So that's not helped our situation here particularly. So basically what has happened is that if you look to the right hand side, this was an overview that we did towards the end of the project, and we thought it would be either something like 850,000 or 980,000, and it's ended up at 980,000. And the big change is in the civils construction costs, you can see there, but we've also increased the contingency as well. So the project 700,000 up to 980,000. But of course, we'd already got 872,000 that people have done. So originally we thought we were going to have to give some of that back, but it's a good job we didn't. So we had to actually write to people and say, are you happy to carry on? Most people were happy to carry on, and also to add a little bit more to their applications to get us to the right total. So what did that mean for them in terms of what it was going to affect their financial investment? So you can see that we had to change the interest rates that were offered from originally 4% all the way through to a staggered interest rate throughout the period. And the thing that's been hurt most, if you like, is the size of the community benefit, which was originally going to be something like 758,000 and is now going to be more like 220,000. And again, most of that coming in the later years of the project. But I have to say that we've probably got about 600 investors. The largest investment, I think, is 80,000 because we put a maximum of 80,000, 10% of the total, sorry, so it must have been 70,000. So we've got one investor that's done 70,000, we've got a couple of 50,000s and a few 10,000s, but I think the average investment is more like about £1,000. So we've got the minimum was £75, and we've got a real sort of mixture there. Most of the people are from the Reading area, but we've had a very good response even when we effectively asked for more money at a lower rate of return for that investment. So we secured the higher level of revenue. We got the start of a lot of clearing of the site in September, and the construction, the civils part, has actually started in October. We came across another issue that we originally wanted. When we decided to move away from a grid connection to a direct connection to the Lido, we had a option to route the cable underneath the river and along the side of the towpath. Unfortunately, there's a lot of trees down the side of the towpath, and we would have run the risk of having to interfere with some of the routes. So we've had to redesign that to have a more direct approach, which basically goes straight across the river, underneath the island and straight into the Lido, which is much less disruptive in any way there. So we've just got to finalise that there. The screws have been ordered, and they're coming from a company called Spans Babcock, who are based in Holland. And here's another surprise. So because they're now going to arrive in February 2021, we will no longer be in the EU by then. So we will have to pay import duty on them. Slightly annoying, but there's not much we could do about that there. But the whole scheme is planned to be operating and commissioned by the end of March 2021. So probably 6 months later than we initially wanted it to be, but on the grand scheme of things with a 40-year life, that's not particularly relevant, I don't think there. And here's finally, just to show you what's going on. So here's the volunteers. You can see there it's quite manual. A lot of the tree clearing you see there were actually dead trees, but some had to be cut down, and there is a plan to replace all the trees have been cut down further down the island later on. But you can see volunteers in high-vis jackets, literally sometimes wading into the water in order to clear the path so that we can do things there. And on the top right, you can see this is literally where the screws will be built and put in. And the idea is that the footpaths have to be closed during this period. When the construction's finished, you will be able to walk over the top of the screws and be able to see them working. And that's quite important because we want to make sure that it's a high visibility scheme. They're quite interesting to watch. The screws turn at about 45 RPM, so it's it's just over a second to go all the way around. So they're quite interesting to watch. They're very sort of hypnotic, the way they just turn very slowly, and you can see the power of the water turning something like 20 tons of metal in each case, I think, round to generate electricity. So quite good fun to watch. But you'll be able to go and see that hopefully in about March next year. And there you go. And you can see we had to put all of the big machinery on the car park side, which, if you know it, is on the north side, the big public car park there. So we've had to build a compound there and then build a pontoon bridge to get from the car park over to the island so that we can get the really heavy materials over. And then lastly, you go. Yeah, so this is the kind of scale of things. So this big machine here is a pile driver, and what that is doing is creating a dam to hold back the water, so we can basically build a big hole where the footpath is and drop in the concrete base to mount the screws on. So you can see there on the right hand side, that's literally where just in front of the people there, that's literally where the screws can be dropped in. So it's big stuff, and you can see why the costs of this probably came in more than expected, because as an example there, here's a machine actually been brought up to the construction site on a barge. So there's various different ways in which we thought we would have to do this, but the answer was to do that by a barge. So I think in summary, it's a classic example of a project that's cost a little bit more. It's not unique in this, even in the hydro schemes. There was the proposal to do one of these in Abingdon, further upstream. The original budget was £1 million that they looked like they were well on the way to raising. Once they'd done the same sort of civil construction detail that we've done, the budget went up to £3 million, and that just blew the economics. So that project didn't happen. It's great that we're still being able to produce something that's a low carbon production system. It's great that it will still produce some community benefit and give the investors a return on their investment. In the absence of a feed-in tariff, though, I can't see that these kind of schemes are repeatable. Because if we didn't have the feed-in tariff revenue for this project, it would not be viable. So I think it's difficult to see how, with the current level of electricity prices, it's difficult to see how you could make such a scheme work unless you had a very low cost place to put the hydro system in, and you could sell all of that output to a final end user. So it's been an exciting time. I've only been involved in it for the last 2 years, but some of the people have been involved right the way through, and it will be fantastic to see it up and running in the end of March next year. So that's all I was going to do from the presentation side. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing so that we can start to answer some of the questions that no doubt have been coming through.
Great, thank you very much, Andy. That's brilliant. So thank you. Right. And there are some questions coming through. Please ask more questions, and I think you can either ask them specifically about the project, or more generally about community energy schemes, or more generally about financing these sort of carbon reduction schemes. So anything that you might be interested in, please do ask. Starting off, Margaret Beasley said, sadly, Ham Hydro at Teddington did not get through the planning process, despite the vast volume of water that passes through Teddington Weir. I don't know if you've heard about that project, but if not, just looking at the sort of solutions to that sort of thing, is there any way of, let's say, making it easier to get through the planning process, any particular way of presentation? If you did know something specific about Ham Hydro, it'd be very interesting.
I do actually, and I think the reason for that not failing wasn't an economic one. It was a local objection one, I believe, by the it's not the Leander Club, some club down there, which I think is owned by BP. And it was, yeah, ironic. And it was, they didn't want their view from the veranda of their club spoilt by having a renewable energy generation thing. And I find that incredible, but it's not the only case I've heard of it. We live near Goring and Streatley, just a little bit upstream, and they had a campaign which completely divided the village. Some people were for it and some people were dead against it. And there are still signs in shops down there saying stop Goring Hydro. And the reason why is because it would spoil the view from the bridge looking at the Weir.
Right, yes, okay.
Interesting.
As if all of our consumption and all the vast amounts of rubbish we produce and everything else doesn't spoil the view in many parts of the country. And in fact, just following straight on from that, when you were going through the planning process, was there a neighbourhood plan in your area? If there was, does it apply to things that are on the river? And if there isn't, and you know about neighbourhood plans, could it have helped you?
Reading Borough Council have been very supportive of this project right from the start. They've got a 2050 vision document, and the hydro scheme is in it. So they will all, luckily the hydro isn't very near any residential properties. The nearest properties are on the Reading side near Reading Bridge. So there's been, the only objections we've had as a group of people is anglers. And the anglers are under the impression that hydro schemes do something terrible to the oxygenation of the water, which harms the fish population. I'm not an expert on that, but we've not seen any academic evidence that that is the case. And I'd also point out it's next to a weir, and a weir is going to be doing an awful lot more changing to the oxygen levels of river than the hydro scheme is going to. But the council themselves have been very supportive. We've got the community element, which has made everyone feel quite comfortable about the idea of it. And one of the key things that we want to try and do is we want to make this an education resource. So there is an idea to share the telemetry of some of the key measures like the water flow and the output from the machine available to all on the website. And we're certainly, I noticed somebody was talking about tours, and we very much imagine this being something that we will get school parties to come to when it's finished, and we'll be able to talk to them about renewable energy in the same way that I went on a tour to Maple Durham and looking at the big wind turbine at the south of Reading near the M4 as well. And
do you think you'll draw some revenue from tours like that?
To be perfectly honest, that's not something we would seek to do. We would seek to do that just as part of the education of low carbon generation. We wouldn't go out of our way to do that. You could do, I guess, but we probably wouldn't.
Right, okay. And just on the fish, is there any fish mortality with hydro projects like this?
So I'm told no, because you've got a screen which obviously lets the water through but stops bigger fish from going through it anyway. But I've heard stories about people dropping fish from one end of a turbine to another, and they're not actually sharp. It's more like quite a wide channel. So I've even heard of ducks falling through them when they've got through somehow and everything. So it's not a serious concern in the same way that, for example, wind projects can sometimes be criticised for the bird mortality.
Right. Question from Will Saunders. How do you deal with the recent floods we've been having? Do you build them with more dramatic and frequent future floodings in mind?
So good question. The recent floodings have meant that there is a term that the Environment Agency use called red boards. And when the river flow gets so high, you're not allowed to do any construction at all on the river source side. And similarly, we would have had to have lifted the turbines out of the water to let the water go through. Have we thought of more extreme variability on the river going forward in the forecast? The answer is no, because we don't know which way it would go. It's based on 15 years worth of river data, and given that climate change has certainly impacted a little bit that on the recent years, then I just don't think we've got good enough information. I mean, you might think that you might have more extreme amounts of weather and therefore water flow, which might therefore restrict your winter capability, but I just don't think we've got a good enough base. You know, it's better to use 15 years of hard data than 3 years of more recent data. And from what we saw on those charts, I'm not sure it's very obvious at the moment anyway.
Right, okay, thank you. From Kevin Webb, more of a comment, but you might like to comment on it. These systems would be good for many third world countries in areas that have no electricity, assuming they're put next to a river, and if the maintenance is low. So I suppose a comment on what's the maintenance like, but also, have you heard of them being used in third world countries in this way?
So interestingly, most of the examples I've seen of this have not been in third world countries. There's two types of hydro systems. There's the big dams and the very high head schemes, which use a different type of a generation system. And there are loads of examples of that in both Africa and in South America. And I think in South America, big hydro schemes are one of the more important sources of electricity generation in places like Brazil. This sort of system, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, especially if you can have an area where there is a reasonable head of river and your construction costs are low, because the maintenance once they're in there is so very low. Yeah, I think they could work, but your construction costs would have to be very much towards the low end compared to what we've got here. Because we're in the middle of a town here with difficult access. If you've got a much easier construction site, then yeah, I mean the cost of the kit is 250,000 pounds, and there's not much else to go on that. So if you can get that kit in for a low construction thing, and you've got the right kind of river conditions, I don't see any reason why that couldn't work.
Great. Talking about maintenance, are these schemes vandal proof?
Yes, they are, but you do have to fence them off pretty well. We've even had people breaking into the site during the construction phase, so that is an area of concern. But yeah, it's got to be fenced off, so still visible but fenced off, and it's quite difficult to do much damage to the screws because they're quite big sturdy things, but all the things like the turbines have got to be in a locked house that we've got to build. And interestingly, one of our key jobs at the moment is because it's a 5 meter long by 3.5 meter side to the building, it's going to be a real graffiti target. So what we're going to do is launch a competition for somebody to design a mural to go along that wall, which will show the combination of water to produce renewable electricity. So we're just launching that at the moment as well.
Well, you could put it out to all the schools, give them all a section to do their own painting of it. That would bring the local youth into it.
It certainly would. We've decided not to do that and go for a single artist, but we've opened up the competition to all of the local artists, and we've even written to Banksy and said, how do you fancy this? So right. You never know.
Brilliant. Okay, from Brian McGavin, can you clarify further why your feed-in tariff to the grid is limited to just 46 kilowatts.
Yeah, so when we did the initial application, we weren't going to do a direct connection to the end customer. We were going to connect it to the local grid access point, which was a substation on the island, and the maximum, the DNO, the network operator told us we could have is 46. So that was why the limit was that. It was to do with the grid connection, which now is slightly irrelevant because we're doing it in a different way. We did try to change that with Ofgem, but they refused, basically.
Right, okay. I mean, if it's not confidential, how long is the contract you've got with the SPA? And I may have missed it myself in what you were doing, but have you got, what's the price structure for the SPA?
Yeah, so it's basically a 10-year agreement. So it was a 5+5, but now it's a 10-year agreement. And the pricing structure is basically the current price that they're paying. And interestingly, they're currently buying renewable energy from a supplier. So they're still going to be doing renewable energy, and they'll still be using that other supplier for the times when we can't supply them. But the pricing mechanism is that starting price, and it goes up by inflation in the same way that the feed-in tariff does. So we've got the same escalator on the price. The only thing is it can't go down below the current price. So it'll go up every year by inflation. And if inflation is negative, it just doesn't change. So it doesn't go down from its previous year, it only goes up.
Right, great. A lot of the investment obviously was local. And what was the smallest investments that were coming in from local investors?
Minimum was £75. So we've got quite a lot of £75 investors.
Right. I mean, just out of interest, how many £75 investors? I'm quite interested to see how the local community gets involved.
Well, I think the total number of investors was about 600. And I think the average was about £1,000, but you had everything from £75 to £70,000. But those big lumpy ones at the end were very much in the minority. Yeah, very popular amount was 100 or 500 or something like that there. And I haven't got the curve for what it looked like. But yeah, it's quite a lot of small ones and some very big ones as well.
Right. Okay. From Ellen, a couple of questions. Was there an initial feasibility study, and how was that funded? And what was the government grant you mentioned for helping the construction?
So the initial studies, we had something called a pioneer share issue, which was, and that's where I first saw the project actually, that was to raise £15,000 to get some basic designs and a working start figure. So that's how that was raised. So that was separate to the what ended up as 980,000. The 100,000 grant from the government was from there's various different names for it, but it came from something called Power for Change. And it's basically ends up coming from BEIS in some sort of way. But they are quite good at sponsoring these kind of projects. And I know that there's another one in the only other hydro one that's being built physically at the moment, which also covered for feed-in tariff, is in Congleton in Cheshire or Staffordshire, Cheshire, I believe. And they had the same thing, and they got a similar sort of grant from Power for Change as well.
Okay, thank you. Have you got any idea of the carbon emissions used in the construction of the project and the construction of the items used to install? If you did, have you looked at when you might reach net zero overall as a project?
I think the figure for that's about 10 years. So 10 years of embedded carbon recovery, and then 30 years of pure generation. I think that's the number that I've seen. And
sorry, did that fit in with when you return the investment after 10 years?
No, I think from memory, if you ignore the funding, the financial payback's in about year 15, but the carbon payback is in about year 10.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, comment from Bill Dowling: if the government was serious about tackling climate change, it would restore the feed-in tariff, making many more schemes possible. I don't know if you've heard anything on that.
So I think there's an organisation called the British Hydropower Association that we're members of, and they are very much lobbying for that. I think one of the difficulties is if you look at the cost per kilowatt of this scheme compared to some other technologies. Hydro isn't the cheapest way of doing it. At the moment, a solar farm, and I think somebody asked the question from what I could see, a solar farm, if you had two equivalent patches of land and you had an option between a solar farm and a hydro, I think a solar farm would be slightly more economical. But I think our view was that, well, this is the only place in Reading you could do a hydro scheme. You can do solar in lots of other things, so it should be seen as incremental to all of the solar stuff that you can do as well. And the actual site wouldn't lend itself very well to solar because it's quite a small site when you look at the actual patch of land that you're going to be using to generate that electricity.
Right. Okay. Well, in fact, then somebody's actually said, how does the cost of small-scale hydro compare with solar panel installations?
It's more expensive, basically.
Okay. Right.
Because if you, so we do work on solar panels as well, and if you don't have feed-in tariff with solar panels anymore, and you can still get a payback within between 8 and 12 years, depending on how much of the output you use yourself. Without the feed-in tariff, you wouldn't get that kind of return on a hydro scheme. But that's only because this particular scheme, if you think about it, probably 60% of its cost is in the construction site. If you could have a cheaper construction site, because it would, for example, if it was replacing some sluice gates on the Weir, which we weren't allowed to do in this case, that would bring the cost of it right down. But yes, solar with the huge number of installations, the cost of panels falling, it is probably the most economic way to do inland generation, I think, at the moment.
Without the feed-in tariff, it occurs to me that maybe the government or local councils could provide subsidies to projects like this, based not just on climate change targets, 2050 net zero, but also on reducing air pollution, in other words, taking strain off the NHS and this sort of thing. Do you happen to know if that's happening anywhere?
I've not heard of I mean, the local council in Reading were very supportive of this, and I think they even put in a few thousand to kick off the initial investigations, but they've not shown any desire to put in serious amounts of money to help this sort of thing happen, and I've not heard that in anywhere else as well.
Kevin Webb makes the comment, actually, when I worked and lived in China, renewable didn't have to make a profit. So.
Well, yeah, and it's, I guess, depends who's funding it, you see. I mean, this has to at least generate enough money to repay its shareholders, or if we borrowed the money from the bank, it would have to make enough money to cover the interest and the repayment. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people say to me, well, you should do this anyway. This shouldn't be about money because, look at the sustainability benefit. But realistically, you've got to get the money from somewhere. So you've got to try and repay that money.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we've got a comment from Kevin Webb. The UK government isn't serious about anything. We've only had 49 COVID deaths in Thailand. Brian McGavin, actually, I suppose, continuing on from his previous question, what was the rationale for refusal to increase the 46 kilowatt feed in the tariff?
I think Ofgem have got a budget for feed-in tariff, and they've set their budget going forward, and they wouldn't want to increase it'd be about a 50% increase in the amount of budget that would be associated with that. It's as simple as that, I think.
Right.
It's very, very short-sighted, because that extra output would have had a very small marginal cost to get that extra renewable generation, and yeah, it's very short-sighted.
Okay, we've had a few more comments, but I wanted to just, Tony Goodchild has asked a question which you half answered in a previous answer, but the SPA is likely to have a fluctuating demand. Are you going to be sending any surplus? Because I'm assuming because the SPA then doesn't need so much, would that surplus then go back into the grid?
It would do, but surprisingly, we've looked at we've had the half-hourly data from the SPA, and it is quite consistent on their energy usage, because most of it's to do with lighting. They don't heat the water using electricity; they do that using gas. But yeah, we've looked at that data, and it's quite similar all year round, to be honest. I mean, obviously it's more in the winter because of the smaller daylight hours, but we've looked at that, and then overall, yeah, we're going to meet 90% of their needs through our output, but at certain times we'll be exporting because we're producing more than they need, and quite a lot of the time they'll be importing because the plant is not working because of low or high river levels.
Right. Okay. Just reading out now a few comments as we come to near the end, and probably be one more question. if the emissions payback is around 10 years in general, and we really need to be zero carbon in 10 years, how can any of our investments in renewable energy work? Belinda's said, Bridport Town Council's launching a renewable energy scheme, and I think Weymouth and Portland councils are also involved in solar schemes. Ellen has asked directly for you, would power hookups for boats be a viable direct customer?
Possibly.
How many moorings do you have nearby? Because that would obviously necessitate having moorings nearby.
Yeah, and I think where it is, that there aren't any moorings on that side of the river. They're on the other side of the river, just down from the lock. So if a boat wanted to come near the hydro to effectively have like an EV charging point type concept, they'd have to go across the Weir in some quite treacherous water. So I guess we could do something off the supply to the Lido, but as far as I know, most boats' propulsion systems are mainly still diesel. I think when we have lots more electric boats, there'll be more of a demand for recharging the batteries on that, but I think that's quite a long way off at the moment. But that's the sort of thing that, you know, within the 40-year timeline, once we're sort of assuming that we might not be supplying the direct customer anymore, that we might be doing more of that. And we're quite near the car park on the other side of the river. So could we supply the electric vehicle charging points in the car park maybe?
And make a much bigger tariff doing that.
Yeah, yeah.
I suppose then the last question from me to finish off. You've got a team together that's pretty much successfully completed the project now. I understand there's a few steps still to go, but what's the team going to do next? Are you already looking at some other projects in the area where the team can turn their hand to it?
Conceptually, yes, but as I said before, we don't think the hydro scheme anywhere else, certainly in Reading, although there are options in different parts of the river and other rivers that we could look at. But frankly, if your objective is to generate renewable energy at a low cost and share those benefits to the community, you probably wouldn't be looking at hydro for the next one. It's more likely to be onshore wind or but even more likely solar, because the planning with onshore wind is quite tricky.
Right, and in fact, actually, one thing I thought when we were looking at your pictures of the other schemes, they were all at weirs. Is there a way you can install a hydro project not at a weir?
Yes, but the river, you do need that head, and the only way on a downstream river like the Thames you can get that is via a weir. But there are other weirs that have not yet got hydro schemes on them, and if particularly you can seek permission to take some of the sluice gates out and drop the turbines into where the sluice gates were, which we've seen at Sandford and in Windsor, that is much cheaper to do. And you know, one question we get asked a lot is, well, why doesn't the Environment Agency do this on every weir? And the answer is money. They haven't got the money to do it.
Right, okay. Kevin Webb's actually made a comment, but isn't nuclear heavily subsidised? I suppose the comment really could be, aren't so many other energy producing industries subsidised in various ways, and really more should be going into renewables, but anyway. Okay, well, Andy, that's absolutely fantastic, brilliant, thank you very much, very inspiring. We did have Bath and West Community Energy doing a talk a couple of days ago on the Energy Day. And it's brilliant to have a talk that's very, very specific and based on the hydro, and you went into the figures in much more detail than we'd seen and that as well. So thank you very, very much. We wish you all the best with it, and thank you for doing the talk. Before we go, we'd like to say that we've got a lot more talks coming today, tomorrow, and the next day on the Scientists Warning Europe programme. Our talk at 1:30 is Dark Optimism, Life After Economic Growth, a future worth fighting for. And in fact, the talks coming up today are certainly by titles very much focusing on the fact that we need to move away from just focusing on GDP all the time. But all of the authors are going, or all of the speakers are going to have their views on that. So please look at joining that. We then have another talk at 3 o'clock, One Planet Prosperity, Choosing Our Future by Design, Not Disaster. And then another talk at 4 o'clock, Sustainability is a Steady State Economy. And just to let you know that if you do want to come to the talk at 4 o'clock, you do have to sign up immediately, as it's going to be oversubscribed. It's very near to stopping the sales on that one. But Dark Optimism and One Planet Prosperity still have plenty of space. So We certainly look forward to hearing from you again, Andy, maybe in the future. And thank you very much for doing that talk. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Bye-bye.
Cheers then. Bye-bye.